The train screeched to a halt at the station. Crowds gathered, waving flags and cheering, as soldiers stepped down one by one. Among them was Tommy Prince, his chest heavy with medals that caught the light like small flashes of glory. He was one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers, a man who had crawled through mud, dodged bullets, and risked his life behind enemy lines. To the world, he was a hero. But heroes don't eat medals. As the celebration faded and the uniforms blended back into ordinary life, Tommy Prince's reality came crashing in. Despite his 16 medals, he returned not to opportunity, but to poverty. The government that had invested billions into the war effort had little to offer the men who fought it, especially Indigenous veterans like him. While factories boomed and cities prospered in the post-war economy, Prince struggled to find steady work. His decorations might have been priceless in history books, but at the pawnshop counter they fetched almost nothing. It was a cruel irony. The man who saved lives, destroyed enemy infrastructure worth millions, and helped turn the tide of battles, was now fighting a different war, this time against poverty, prejudice, and neglect. The story of Tommy Prince is about the cost of war when the guns fall silent, and how a nation can praise a soldier's bravery yet abandon him in peace. Long before Tommy Prince became a soldier, he was a boy growing up on the broken-head Ojibwe Nation Reserve in Manitoba. Life there was not one of promise, but of survival. Poverty was constant. The 1920s and 30s had already been cruel years across Canada, scarred by the Great Depression. But for Indigenous families, hardship was magnified. Opportunities were scarce. Jobs that existed in nearby towns were often closed to First Nations men, or paid a fraction of what white workers earned. Education was limited, and the shadow of systemic discrimination loomed over every choice. For young Tommy, dreams cost more than his family could afford. He learned resilience early. Hunting, trapping, and fishing weren't hobbies. They were survival skills. Each rabbit snared and each fish caught meant one more day of food on the table. That resourcefulness would later serve him well in the forests of Europe, but at the time it was simply the way he had to live. By the time he reached adulthood, one thing was clear. Poverty was a battle he couldn't win at home. For many Indigenous men like Tommy, the military offered the only steady paycheck, the only chance to travel beyond the reserve, the only hope for recognition in a country that barely acknowledged their existence. So when war drums echoed across the world, Tommy Prince enlisted because poverty left him little choice. The battlefield, as dangerous as it was, promised something his homeland never had: opportunity. The world Tommy Prince stepped into as a young man was one still reeling from the Great Depression. The 1930s had stripped families bare. Jobs vanished, crops failed, and the value of money itself seemed to shrink overnight. Across Canada, men stood in bread lines, waiting hours for a meal that lasted minutes. On the reserve, the struggle was even harsher. But as Europe plunged into chaos, a strange paradox unfolded. War meant opportunity. Nations poured billions into the war machine, building tanks, planes, and rifles at a pace never seen before. Factories that once sat silent roared back to life. Cities buzzed with the promise of work. Yet, for all the billions invested, the men who fought the war, the very ones who risked their lives, were paid just a few dollars a month. Still, for someone like Tommy Prince, even a modest soldier's wage was more than he could hope for at home. Enlistment meant 3 meals a day, a uniform, and a steady paycheck sent back to his family. It meant purpose in a world where the deck had always been stacked against him. So when Canada joined the war, Prince was ready. For many young men, enlistment was a call to defend freedom. For Tommy, it was also a fight to escape the chains of poverty. The battlefield promised danger, but it also promised something the reserve never could: the hope of a better future. During the Second World War, Tommy Prince served with the elite 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion, a joint Canadian-American unit better known as the Devil's Brigade. This was no ordinary battalion. It was a hand-picked force trained for the dirtiest, most dangerous work: reconnaissance, sabotage, and raids deep behind enemy lines. For Tommy, it was the perfect stage to show the skills he had sharpened since childhood. One of his most famous missions came in 1944 during the Italian campaign. Allied forces were struggling to push the Germans out of the rugged countryside. Prince volunteered for reconnaissance and crept more than a kilometer behind enemy lines. Disguised as a farmer, he calmly moved through occupied territory, scouting German positions. For days, he repaired a broken Allied telephone line under the noses of enemy soldiers, pretending to adjust his bootlace whenever they drew near. With the line restored, Allied artillery rained down on German positions with deadly precision. The damage inflicted on enemy defenses was immense, all thanks to a single man with nerves of steel. But that was just one story. In France, during the invasion of southern Europe, Prince once again proved his mastery of stealth. He infiltrated enemy territory and set up an observation post just 200 meters from German lines. For 72 hours, without sleep, he relayed constant updates on troop movements and artillery positions. His intelligence allowed the Allies to destroy 4 German camps and a battalion headquarters. When he finally returned, exhausted and starving, his commanding officer called it one of the most remarkable feats of the campaign. Prince was also a fighter. He led patrols, launched raids, and was known for his uncanny ability to disappear into the landscape and reappear with crucial information. His training as a marksman and his natural instincts in the wild made him a nightmare for enemy soldiers. What set him apart was not only his skill, but his audacity. Where others saw suicide missions, Prince saw opportunity. Time and again, he volunteered for the riskiest assignments and came back with results that saved Allied lives. His combination of fearlessness and ingenuity earned him the Military Medal from Britain and the Silver Star from the United States, 2 of the highest honors a soldier could receive. Yet, back at camp, the numbers told a different story. For this mission, Tommy Prince earned the same soldier's wage as any other private, barely enough to buy a pair of boots back home. The economic irony was staggering. A single act of sabotage could tilt the balance of a battlefield, but the man who carried it out was rewarded with little more than rations and a pat on the back. By the war's end, Tommy Prince's chest was heavy with honors. 16 medals, the kind of recognition most soldiers could only dream of, clinked against his uniform. Newspapers called him a hero, officers praised his bravery, and his name carried weight across battlefields. To the public, he was proof of Canadian valor. But medals don't pay rent. For all his exploits, missions that saved lives and cost the enemy millions, Prince earned the same modest wage as any private. Soldiers were celebrated in posters and parades, yet when their boots hit Canadian soil, they discovered a cruel truth. The nation that invested billions in war had budgeted very little for its warriors. The propaganda machine had painted soldiers as symbols of honor and sacrifice, but the reality was far less noble. Many veterans struggled to find work, their military paychecks replaced with empty promises. And for Indigenous veterans like Tommy Prince, the gap was even wider. While white veterans returned home to land grants, housing loans, and steady jobs, Indigenous soldiers faced walls of bureaucracy and discrimination. Policies that looked fair on paper were twisted in practice. Land grants were denied, benefits withheld, and opportunities quietly shut off. The very men who had risked their lives for Canada now found themselves second-class citizens in peace. For Tommy Prince, the medals on his chest became a bitter reminder. Each one represented not just courage, but also a promise that was never kept. He had proven himself on the battlefield, yet in his own homeland, he still had to fight, for dignity, for work, for the right to simply belong. The war ended, and Canada changed almost overnight. Cities buzzed with new life. Factories that once forged tanks now built cars, houses, and appliances. Suburbs grew, businesses thrived, and returning veterans poured into colleges and offices, riding the wave of a booming post-war economy. For many, the war had been a doorway into prosperity, but not for Tommy Prince. When he stepped back into civilian life, he carried the same medals that once made him a hero, but they opened no doors. While others bought homes with government assistance, he was denied benefits that should have been his by right. Promises of land for Indigenous veterans dissolved in bureaucratic red tape. Jobs were scarce, and the ones that existed rarely welcomed a First Nations man, no matter how many medals glimmered on his chest. Prince took whatever work he could find, odd jobs, temporary labor, anything that put food on the table. But it was never enough. Poverty clung to him as tightly as the uniform he had once worn with pride. Eventually, even that struggle slipped away. Homelessness became his companion, the streets his barracks. The irony was brutal. This was the man who had once crawled behind enemy lines, cutting communication wires that cost the Nazis millions. He had done the work of entire battalions, tipping battles with nothing more than courage and cunning. Yet in peacetime, Tommy Prince had to fight for scraps of food, for shelter, for the most basic dignity. The guns had fallen silent, but for Tommy, the war never truly ended. It had only changed battlefields. By the late 1940s, Tommy Prince was a war hero living in poverty. The parades were over, the flags put away, and the promises forgotten. With little steady work and no real support, his life had narrowed into a daily fight for survival. And then, in 1950, the world erupted again, this time on the Korean Peninsula. For many Canadians, Korea was a distant conflict, half a world away. But for Tommy, it was something else entirely, a chance. The army was calling for men, and with it came steady pay, meals, and the sense of purpose that had long slipped from his hands. Once again, the battlefield offered what civilian life refused him. He enlisted without hesitation. In Korea, he proved, again, that courage was his constant companion. He led men through ambushes, scouted enemy positions, and carried the same fearless spirit that had made him legendary in Europe. Soldiers looked to him for guidance, and he delivered, time and again. When war erupted on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, Tommy Prince was no longer a young soldier eager for adventure. He was a seasoned veteran, carrying the scars and the wisdom of battles fought across Europe. But despite the years that had passed, one thing remained unchanged: his instinct for combat. When Canada committed troops to the conflict, Prince re-enlisted, joining the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Once again, he would find himself on the front lines of some of the most grueling fighting of the war. In Korea, the terrain was unforgiving: steep hills, icy winters, and enemy forces entrenched in hidden positions. For ordinary soldiers, it was a nightmare. For Prince, it was familiar ground. His skills as a scout and marksman made him invaluable in a war defined by sudden ambushes and desperate defenses. One of his most remarkable actions came during a patrol deep into contested territory. Leading his men through treacherous terrain, Prince guided them past enemy listening posts, moving silently as if the hills themselves sheltered them. When they finally engaged the enemy, it was Prince's quick thinking that allowed his unit to strike hard and withdraw before the Chinese and North Korean forces could counterattack. His ability to sense danger before it appeared often meant the difference between survival and disaster. Prince had a way of steadying nerves under fire. Men who served with him recalled how calm he remained, even as bullets cracked overhead. He had survived the chaos of Italy and France. Korea, no matter how brutal, was just another battlefield to him. That confidence radiated to the men he led. In another action, Prince helped secure high ground that enemy forces had turned into a fortress. The fighting was fierce, but his knowledge of infiltration tactics, slipping behind enemy lines, flanking positions, using the terrain to his advantage, proved decisive. His unit not only held the ground but inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. For his courage in Korea, Tommy Prince was once again decorated, awarded additional medals to add to the 16 he had already earned in the Second World War. Few soldiers in Canadian history could claim to have fought two wars on opposite sides of the globe, excelling in both. But what stands out most from Korea was not just his bravery, but his consistency. Prince didn't return to war to chase glory. He returned because soldiering was what he knew best, and on the battlefield he was unmatched. Whether crawling through the mud in Italy or climbing frozen hills in Korea, Tommy Prince was the same warrior, fearless, sharp, and unyielding. By the end of the Korean War, his reputation as one of Canada's greatest soldiers was beyond question. He had once again proven himself not just as a fighter, but as a leader whose presence tilted the balance of battle. On 2 continents, in 2 wars, Tommy Prince had shown what true combat skill looked like. But history, it seemed, had no intention of changing its course. When he returned from Korea, his bravery was acknowledged, his medals counted, but his pockets were as empty as before. The same cycle repeated: heroism abroad, neglect at home. The war economy had needed him, and he answered. But when the guns fell silent, the same walls of poverty and prejudice rose up once more. For Tommy Prince, victory on the battlefield never translated into victory in life. He had fought 2 wars abroad and returned to fight the same one at home, the war against invisibility. Tommy Prince's life after the wars was a reflection of something larger, something systemic. While Canada celebrated its booming post-war economy, Indigenous people remained on the margins, locked out of the prosperity they had helped secure. Prince was living proof of that divide. 16 medals on his chest, but no home to return to. He had proven his worth in battle, yet in peace he was treated as if that sacrifice meant nothing. The economic cost of this neglect was staggering, though less visible than the tanks or planes Canada had once bought. By leaving men like Prince behind, the country wasted talent, leadership, and skill that could have enriched communities and industries. Instead of investing in veterans who had risked everything, the system pushed them into cycles of poverty and dependence. For Tommy, the result was heartbreaking. He became a symbol, not just of bravery, but of betrayal. The same country that sent him to sabotage enemy supply lines worth millions could not supply him with the basics of survival. His story was not unique. It was shared by countless Indigenous veterans who returned home to face a war of discrimination and exclusion. Wars are measured in billions. Billions spent on weapons, on factories, on feeding the great machine of destruction. Governments mobilize entire economies when the enemy is near, sparing no cost to defend freedom. But when the battles are won and the soldiers return, the numbers tell a quieter, crueler story. Nations invest in war, but far too often they fail to invest in the men who fought it. Tommy Prince's life is the starkest example. He was one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers, a man whose courage on the battlefield could not be questioned. He died not as the honored hero his medals proclaimed, but as a man forgotten by the system he had served. His story forces us to ask a difficult question. How do we measure the value of a life? By the medals on a chest, or by the dignity a country is willing to give its veterans? In the end, Tommy Prince fought 2 wars. The first was against the enemy, across the fields of Italy and the hills of Korea. The second was at home, against poverty and prejudice. And while the first war earned him medals, it was the second that defined the true cost of his heroism.